Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
From warships off Venezuela to rule changes in the Senate, lawmakers are back in Washington and facing some big issues. Republicans are pushing to fast-track Trump nominees with a new group vote strategy, while Democrats dig in over funding fights that could trigger a government shutdown. Meanwhile, the president's expanded use of military force, including National Guard deployments and a Caribbean crackdown, is raising fresh legal and constitutional questions. Here with the latest on who's playing hardball and what's at stake is WTOP's Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
You know, normally in September, we'd be talking about resource issues, and we'll get to those. But I want us to start for a minute with some military topics. You know, we haven't used the phrase gunboat diplomacy in a while, and that seems to be what's happening between the United States and Venezuela. We've got federalization of the National Guard, and now we've got an executive order to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War. I would be thinking that the International Affairs Committees or the Armed Services Committees in Congress might have something to say about these. Have you seen that?
I have, and they are saying some things about. Yes, there's a lot of attention related to this attack on the Venezuelan vessel that claimed the lives of 11 people. This is something that, frankly, caught a lot of lawmakers by surprise. And Democratic lawmakers in particular are really concerned about the fact that they were not given any kind of heads up that this was going to happen. Democratic senators on the Intelligence Committee say they were not briefed ahead of this attack, which often happens, at least in the past has happened in terms of various attacks by the U.S. And interestingly, a Republican who's a senior member of the Intelligence Committee, Jim Rich, he actually said he was briefed. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there in connection with the Republicans and the Democrats, and the administration is saying, well, these are bad guys. We're going after them. And I think this is just another indication of the fact that the power is more and more residing in the executive branch, and that really takes us to the federalization of the National Guard. Obviously, there's been a lot of concerns related to that in connection with Democratic governors saying, wait a second, can the president actually tell us that he wants the Guard to come to our cities or our states, and we didn't ask him to do that. But really what the administration has been seeming to do is to take action and then ask for forgiveness if they do later. So in the case of D.C., what we're seeing now is upcoming, there is supposed to be a required vote of Congress to approve extension of the 30-day crime emergency in D.C. As stipulated under the D.C. Home Rule Act. However, Republican leaders recently said, wait a second, we don't really need to do that because the mayor has shown that she is working with the administration. And so essentially the House and the Senate have indicated that they are not going to vote on this and that there will be kind of an end around related to it. So again, it's this sign that a lot of power is really more and more residing in the executive branch, and there are definitely concerns, not only from Democrats, but some Republicans as well, that it might be moving too far in that direction.
If they do sense that it's moving too far, what actions might they take to restore the balance?
Well, there's been some action. Let's take, for example, tariffs, which used to be the purview, or still is really, at least under the law, of Congress, that they have the power of the purse, and there's been some court cases that have indicated that the administration can't go as far as it could. So they can still put together legislation, which they have. Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, for example, has said, well, these executive orders that claim that there is a national emergency, for example, related to energy or other topics, that the administration can't do that. And so they are introducing legislation piecemeal and periodically, but trying to, at certain points at least, put some checks on the president before he moves into another direction.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's the Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Well, Mitchell, speaking about taking back power, the Republicans in the Senate are proposing some new rules about confirmations and a way to speed those up. Tell us about what's happening there.
Right. So this has been a big problem, really, complained about by both sides, Democrats and Republicans. And this is a familiar tale, but when the Republicans have power, as they do now, then the Democrats will try to slow things down, and it'll happen vice versa if the Democrats have power. And what we have found over the last decade or so is that many senators are complaining that the Senate body, which is supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, is doing nothing but essentially stamping approval or disapproval of all these nominees from the administration. And it eats up incredible amounts of time. And Democrats have been doing what Republicans did in the past, and they basically stretch out all of the debate so that it takes all of the legislative time away from the floor. So what Republicans are saying is, we're tired of this. Some call it a nuclear option. I don't think it goes as far as some of the things that have happened in the past with Supreme Court nominees, but essentially they want to package a lot of these nominees so that they can all move through in a big group, and that you don't have to have each one of these nominees take hours and hours of debate. And right now, of course, the Democrats are pushing back really hard about this. But I think, privately, I think members of both parties would like to see this in some way streamlined in a more improved fashion.
It sounds like they carved out an exception for cabinet secretaries, but otherwise they'd be able to group lower level nominees kind of all together.
Right, exactly. So you have the higher level people, the cabinet secretaries, who would still be required to get that type of vote. But then the lower level people, there are just so many nominees, as you know. I mean, there are literally thousands of nominees, and then they would try to work out a way to get those lower level nominees through.
Well, there is a lot of conversation on the Hill about changing rules in other places as well. So how does that all fit together? Now we'll get to the resource question as we start to think about the 2026 appropriations.
Right. And this really goes back to what we were just talking about, the fact that many members of Congress feel that the appropriations process right now is breaking down. You have the rescissions, the pocket rescission from the administration recently, and there's a court battle related to that, whether they can claw back close to $5 billion in foreign aid, as well as including USAID money. And right now, that is souring relations between Republicans and Democrats, even more so than it usually is. And some Republicans are also concerned about this. One of the chief Republican appropriators, Susan Collins, has actually said that she thinks the pocket rescission is illegal. But it really complicates the fact that they've got to get this continuing resolution done in the next few weeks. And even though there have been some early talks between House Speaker Mike Johnson and his Democratic counterpart, Hakeem Jeffries, they're very much in the preliminary mode right now, and we only have a few weeks until the deadline, of course, comes on October 1st. So I think we're going to, at some point, see some type of showdown in the next couple of weeks, and it really depends, I think, on whether the Democrats are going to decide we've had enough, we're going to take a stand here, and we're actually going to risk a shutdown, or whether they do a variety of other things legislatively, but then eventually cave in the view of some of their more critical members of the Democratic Party. So it's going to get very complicated over the next few weeks.
Just one more complication in that whole stew, I guess, is recent court decisions that said that the administration actually has to release those billions in foreign aid and actually funds back to Harvard. So in this conversation about rescission, not rescission, appropriation, not appropriation, now you have courts saying you have to let some of the money out the door. How does that play in?
Well, I think that is kind of the last resort, frankly, for many Democrats in Congress. When you ask them, what are you doing, as you pointed out, what are you doing to push back, or what are you doing to, if you're concerned about how the money is being spent? And increasingly, this is going to the courts rather than in Congress. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because what essentially is happening is the Trump administration, as you know, is testing everything, whether it's the money for Harvard or whether it's to claw back this money from USAID. And they are just throwing it into the courts, and then it goes back and forth, and then they wait for it to bubble up and appeal and eventually get to the Supreme Court. So in some respects, it really slows down the process of just getting money to various agencies, various departments, because they're all tied up in the courts.
Mitchell Miller is the Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks as always for joining me.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites in airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business. And more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge? And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this, certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority. And that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction. But of course, it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.